The scream tore through the night before anyone could stop it. Elara pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the pack house, her heart slamming against her ribs as heavy footsteps thundered past her hiding place. She had learned long ago that screams in Silverfang territory rarely meant help was coming. They meant someone had been caught where they should not be, and tonight, that someone was her. She was only 8 years old when the fire took half her face, but she was 23 now, and the fear that fire had planted in her had never left. It lived in her chest like a second heartbeat, always ready to remind her that safety was something other people got to have. Tonight she had made a mistake. She had lingered too long near the training grounds, watching the young warriors spar in the moonlight, wishing for just one moment that she could stand among them without the veil that covered the scarred side of her face. That single moment of longing had cost her. 2 guards had spotted her, and their leader, a broad-shouldered wolf named Garrick, had shouted for her to halt in a tone that promised nothing gentle. She had run instead. Now her lungs burned and her legs shook, but she forced herself to stay still, to breathe slow and quiet, as the guards passed within a few feet of her without looking her way. When the sound of their boots faded into the distance, she allowed herself to slide down the wall until she was sitting in the dirt, her knees pulled to her chest. This was her life, not the running, though that happened often enough. It was the constant reminder that she did not belong, that her presence anywhere near the heart of the pack was an intrusion that needed to be corrected. She adjusted the veil that covered the right side of her face, the thin gray fabric that had become as much a part of her as her own skin. It was not decoration, it was protection, a barrier between her scars and the eyes of people who could not look at her without flinching, without whispering, without turning away as if her face carried some kind of curse. The scars were old. She barely remembered the fire itself, only fragments, the smell of smoke, the sound of her mother screaming her name, the searing pain that had taken away her hearing for 3 days afterward. What she remembered clearly, what she could never forget, was waking up in the healer's tent and seeing her own reflection for the first time. The right side of her face was a map of ridges and pale lines, stretching from her temple to her jaw, twisting the corner of her mouth into a permanent, subtle downturn. She had been a child then, and children do not always understand what the world will do to them because of how they look. She understood now. Her father had died in the same fire, trying to pull her free from the collapsing beam that trapped her. Her mother, unable to bear the grief, had passed only 2 years later, leaving Elara in the care of a distant aunt who saw her not as family, but as a burden to be managed. When the aunt remarried into the Voss household, Elara became something even smaller than a burden. She became invisible, except when her stepmother needed someone to blame. Miranda Voss ran her household the way a general ran an army, with rules that existed only to be broken by everyone except Elara. Miranda's 2 daughters, Clara and Diane, were golden-haired and golden-tempered when it suited them, quick to laugh, quicker to sneer. They had grown up believing that Elara's scars were a kind of shame that reflected on the whole family, and they made sure Elara never forgot it. "Cover that thing before someone sees you," Clara would say, most mornings, not even looking up from her mirror. "It's bad enough we have to live with you. The rest of the pack shouldn't have to suffer too." Elara had stopped responding to comments like that years ago. Silence was easier. Silence did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction, and more importantly, silence kept her safe from worse things than words. She rose from the dirt now, brushing off her skirts, and made her way back toward the servants' quarters through a path she knew by memory, one that avoided the main square and the guards who patrolled it. As she walked, she thought about the strange announcement that had spread through the pack that morning, like wildfire. The Alpha King was coming. Not just any Alpha King. Kael Draven, ruler of the Draven bloodline, commander of the strongest pack alliance in the Northern Territories, was making a rare visit to Silverfang lands. And he was not coming for politics or trade, though those things would surely be discussed. He was coming, the messengers said, to choose a mate. Every unmarried woman in the pack had spent the day in a frenzy of preparation, trying dresses, practicing curtsies, whispering about what it might mean to become queen of the Draven pack. Elara had listened to the excitement from the shadows of the kitchen, scrubbing pots while Clara and Diane argued over which gown would best catch a king's eye. She had felt nothing but a distant, hollow kind of amusement. No one had even considered that she might attend. Miranda had made that clear before the sun had fully risen. "You will stay in the kitchens during the ceremony," Miranda had said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. It was simply a fact to her, as obvious as saying the sky was blue. "It would not do for the king to think our family has anything unfortunate to hide. You understand." Elara understood. She always understood. Understanding was the one thing life had given her in abundance, even when kindness had been in short supply. She reached the small room she shared with two other servant girls and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, pulling off her boots with tired fingers. Through the thin wall, she could hear Clara's voice rising in excitement as she described the golden gown she planned to wear the next day, the one Miranda had commissioned from the finest tailor in the territory. Elara closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to be looked at with wonder, instead of pity or disgust. She imagined a version of herself without scars, walking into a grand hall, every eye following her, not away from her. It was a foolish thing to imagine, she knew. Foolish thoughts had a way of making the real world hurt more when it came crashing back in. But there was another part of her, a small and stubborn part that had survived every cruelty the world had thrown at her, that refused to fully believe she was as worthless as everyone insisted. That part of her had kept her walking, kept her working, kept her waking up every morning even when there seemed to be little reason to. A soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Nella, one of the older servant women who had shown her small kindnesses over the years, standing with a folded piece of cloth in her hands. "I heard you'll be in the kitchens tomorrow," Nella said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "I thought you might want a proper veil at least. This one is finer than what you have." Elara took the offered cloth, surprised by the softness of it, the careful stitching along its edges. It was a small gift, but in a life so often defined by what was withheld from her, it felt enormous. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it more than the words could show. Nella patted her arm once before disappearing back down the hallway, leaving Elara alone with the new veil and her thoughts. She turned it over in her hands, studying the fine weave, before setting it aside and lying down on her bed. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept circling back to the king's visit, to the strange nervous energy that had filled the pack house all day. She wondered, briefly and uselessly, what kind of man Kael Draven was. The stories that traveled between packs painted him as fierce in battle and fair in judgment, a leader who had expanded his territory not through cruelty, but through strength that others respected rather than feared. Some stories said he had never taken a mate because no woman had ever impressed him. Others said he simply had not found the right one yet. It did not matter to her, she told herself. Whatever kind of man he was, whatever kind of mate he chose, none of it would touch her life. She would be in the kitchens, scrubbing pots and stirring stew, while golden-haired girls like Clara and Diane paraded before a king who would never know she existed. That thought, more than any other, finally pulled her toward sleep, heavy and strange, like a stone sinking slowly into dark water. She woke before dawn to the sound of the household stirring, Miranda's voice already sharp and commanding from somewhere down the hall, ordering servants to fetch water, iron dresses, prepare breakfast for a family too excited to sit still. Elara rose and dressed quickly, tying her hair back and securing Nella's gift of a veil over the scarred side of her face, with hands that had done this same motion thousands of times before. She caught her reflection for only a moment in the small, cracked mirror that hung above the wash basin. Even with most of her face hidden, she could see the outline of the damage the fire had left behind, the way the veil could soften but never erase what lay beneath it. She looked away quickly, as she always did, and went to begin her work. The kitchens were already a storm of activity by the time she arrived. Cooks shouted orders over the clatter of pots. Servants rushed back and forth with trays of food meant for the pack elders who would greet the king upon his arrival. And somewhere above them all, the sound of excited chatter drifted down from the main hall where the eligible women of the pack were gathering, dressed in their finest, waiting. Elara took her place at the wash basin, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and began the long, familiar work of scrubbing pots blackened by years of use. It was mindless labor, the kind that let her thoughts wander even while her hands stayed busy. And for a while, she almost managed to forget about the commotion happening just beyond the kitchen doors. Almost. A sudden hush fell over the main hall above, so complete and so sudden that even the cooks in the kitchen paused in their work, heads tilting upward as if they could see through the ceiling. Then, faintly, the sound of horns echoed from outside the packhouse walls, deep and resonant, the kind of sound that announced the arrival of someone whose presence changed the shape of a room before he even entered it. The Alpha King had arrived. Ilara felt something strange stir in her chest, something she could not quite name. It was not hope, exactly. She had learned not to allow herself hope, not fully, not after so many years of watching it be crushed. But it was something close to curiosity, a small flicker of interest in a world that had given her so little reason to be curious about anything at all. She wiped her hands on her apron and, for just a moment, allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to stand in that hall instead of this kitchen, to see the king with her own eyes, instead of hearing about him secondhand through the excited whispers of servants rushing past. Then Miranda's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade, calling for more trays, more wine, more haste, and Ilara pushed the thought away and returned to her work, telling herself firmly that some doors were never meant to open for girls like her. She did not yet know how wrong she was. The great hall of the Silverfang packhouse had never looked so grand. Long tables draped in deep blue cloth lined the walls, laden with food that most servants would never taste. Candles burned in iron holders along every column, casting warm light over the gathered crowd of pack members, elders, and eligible young women who stood in careful rows, each one hoping to catch the eye of the man now walking through the great wooden doors. Cale Draven entered without fanfare, though none was needed. His presence alone seemed to still the air in the room. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of a warrior who had earned every muscle through discipline rather than vanity, with dark hair cropped close, and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. He wore no crown, no elaborate robes, only a simple dark coat that marked him as someone who valued substance over display, and yet everyone in that hall understood, without needing to be told, that they were standing in the presence of true power. Beside him walked his second-in-command, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Rowan, who scanned the room with the wary attention of someone who trusted very little and expected less. Behind them came a small escort of warriors, their expressions unreadable, their postures alert, despite being deep within what was meant to be friendly territory. The Silverfang Alpha, an aging but still formidable man named Edmund Hale, stepped forward to greet his guest, with the kind of practiced warmth that came from decades of political maneuvering. "Alpha King Cale," Edmund said, bowing his head slightly. "Your presence honors our pack." "The honor is mine," Cale replied, his voice deep and even, carrying easily across the hall without needing to be raised. "I have heard much about the strength of Silverfang territory. I look forward to seeing if the stories hold true." Miranda Voss stood near the front of the gathered women, positioning her daughters Clara and Diane as close to the king's path as propriety would allow. Clara wore the golden gown she had spoken of for days, her hair arranged in elaborate braids studded with small white flowers. Diane, only a year younger, wore a deep green dress that complemented her eyes, and both sisters wore expressions of practiced, hopeful charm. Ilara, far below in the kitchens, could hear none of the introductions, only the muffled roar of the crowd above, and the occasional burst of applause that filtered down through the floorboards. She continued her work, scrubbing and stacking, telling herself she felt nothing about being excluded from the event that had consumed the entire household for days. It was, of course, a lie she told herself out of necessity rather than belief. Upstairs, the formal introductions had given way to a more relaxed gathering, where the king was meant to walk among the pack members and speak with those who wished to be considered as potential mates. Edmund Hale guided him personally, introducing prominent families, offering commentary on lineage and standing that Cale listened to with polite but distant attention. He had done this before, in other territories, other packs, and each time the pattern was largely the same. Beautiful young women, eager to impress, would curtsy and smile, and offer carefully rehearsed words meant to showcase their grace, their intelligence, their suitability for a throne. Cale had grown tired of the performance long before tonight, though he had not yet found a way to explain that to the elders, who kept arranging these gatherings on his behalf. He greeted Clara and Diane Voss with the same polite interest he had shown a dozen other young women that evening. Clara spoke at length about her family's contributions to Silverfang trade routes, while Diane attempted to charm him with a story about a recent hunting excursion, embellishing her own role in it considerably. Cale nodded where appropriate, asked a few measured questions, and moved on, when Edmund gestured toward the next family waiting to be introduced. It was during a brief lull in the introductions, while Edmund was momentarily pulled aside by one of his advisors, that Cale found himself standing near the edge of the hall, closer to the doors that led toward the kitchens than to the center of the celebration. He was not searching for anything in particular. He simply needed a moment away from the constant press of eager faces and rehearsed words. That was when he heard it. A voice, low and clear, coming from somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, humming a simple, unfamiliar tune, while dishes clinked together in a steady rhythm. There was something in the sound that caught his attention immediately, though he could not have said exactly why. It was unpolished in a way that felt honest, unlike everything else he had heard that night. He did not investigate, not yet. But the sound stayed with him, even as Edmund returned, apologizing for the interruption and steering him back toward the heart of the gathering. The evening wore on. More introductions, more careful words, more calculated smiles from women who saw in him not a person, but a position, a title, a life of comfort and power they hoped to claim for themselves. Cale found himself growing more distant with each passing hour, his responses shorter, his patience thinner. It was near the end of the formal gathering, when many of the guests had begun to relax into easier conversation, that Cale excused himself briefly, telling Edmund he wished to walk the grounds and clear his head. Edmund, sensing that further pressing would not be welcome, allowed it, though he sent Rowan trailing a discreet distance behind to ensure the king's safety. Cale did not walk far. His path curved naturally toward the side of the pack house where the kitchens were located, drawn by something he could not quite articulate even to himself. Perhaps it was simple curiosity about the voice he had heard earlier. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something instinctive that he did not yet have words for. Through a narrow window near the kitchen entrance, he caught sight of movement inside. A young woman stood at a wash basin, her back mostly to him, dark hair falling loose from its tie, a plain gray veil covering the side of her face turned away from him. She moved with quiet efficiency, stacking clean dishes with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of repetition, humming softly under her breath as she worked. There was nothing about the scene that should have held his attention. He had seen countless servants going about countless tasks in countless pack houses across his territory, and yet something about this particular scene made him pause, made him linger at that window longer than he could easily explain. Perhaps it was the stillness in her posture, so different from the restless, performative energy of the women he had spoken with all evening. Perhaps it was the way she seemed entirely unaware of being watched, entirely herself in a way that felt rare and valuable, in a world so often built on performance. Rowan approached quietly from behind, his sharp eyes following his king's gaze toward the kitchen window. "Something interesting, my lord?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Cale did not answer immediately. He watched a moment longer as the young woman finished her stack of dishes and turned, giving him a brief glimpse of her profile before she moved deeper into the kitchen, out of view. Even from that brief glimpse, he could see the edge of scarring along her jaw, visible despite the veil that covered most of it. "Who is she?" Cale asked quietly, more to himself than to Rowan. Rowan studied the window for a moment before shrugging. "A servant by the look of it. Perhaps kitchen staff. Why do you ask?" Cale did not have a good answer, not one he was ready to voice aloud. He simply shook his head and turned away from the window, though the image of the young woman's quiet stillness stayed with him as he made his way back toward the great hall to rejoin the celebration he had grown so tired of only minutes before. The rest of the evening passed in something of a blur for him. He returned to his duties as a guest of honor, exchanging pleasantries, listening to Edmund's careful political maneuvering, watching young women parade their charms before him with practiced precision. But some part of his attention kept drifting back toward the kitchens, toward the memory of a voice humming an unfamiliar tune, and a profile marked by scars that had not made her seem broken, only real. When the formal gathering finally ended and guests began retiring for the night, Cale found himself standing alone on a balcony, overlooking the pack house grounds, the cool night air a welcome relief after hours spent in crowded rooms. Rowan joined him after a while, leaning against the stone railing with the easy familiarity of a friend rather than a subordinate. "You seem distracted tonight," Rowan observed, watching his king's profile in the moonlight. I was, Cale admitted, not bothering to deny it. There was little point in pretending with Rowan, who had known him long enough to see through most attempts at deflection. Any particular reason? Cale was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer a question he did not fully understand himself. There was a girl in the kitchen, he said finally. A servant. I only saw her for a moment. Rowan raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this answer from a man who had spent the entire evening surrounded by women, specifically presented for his consideration. A servant girl caught your attention over the daughters of half the noble families in this territory? I know how it sounds, Cale said, a faint, almost embarrassed edge to his voice that Rowan had rarely heard from him before. I cannot explain it. There was something about her, a stillness, honesty perhaps, in a place that has offered me very little of it tonight. Rowan studied his king for a long moment, weighing his response carefully. Do you intend to seek her out? Cale did not answer right away. He looked out over the dark grounds of the pack house, toward the kitchen windows now dark and quiet, and felt something stir within him that he had not felt in a very long time, not through years of careful introductions and calculated matches. It was curiosity, yes, but it was something more than that too, something that felt dangerously close to hope. I do not know yet, he said finally, but I intend to find out who she is. Below them, unaware of the conversation happening above, Ilara finished her final tasks in the kitchen and made her way back toward the servants' quarters, exhausted from a long day of labor, her mind still faintly troubled by fragments of laughter and music that had drifted down from the celebration she had not been permitted to attend. She had no way of knowing that somewhere above her, in the cool night air of the balcony, the most powerful man in the Northern Territories had just spoken her existence into being for the very first time, though he did not yet know her name. News traveled fast within the walls of the pack house, faster than Ilara could have imagined, and by the time she woke the next morning, the household was already buzzing with a strange new rumor that made her stomach twist with unease before she even understood why. The king asked about a servant girl, Diane was saying breathlessly to her sister, as Ilara passed through the hallway carrying a basket of linens. One of the guards told Mother's maid. He was seen near the kitchens last night, asking questions. Clara's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence from the previous evening replaced by something sharper, more calculating. Which servant girl? No one knows for certain. Someone with scars, they say, wearing a veil. The basket of linens nearly slipped from Ilara's hands. She caught it just in time, her heart suddenly pounding so loudly she was certain the sisters must be able to hear it from where they stood. She kept walking, forcing her expression to remain neutral, though every instinct in her screamed that this could not be happening, that there had to be some mistake. She had been in the kitchen the entire evening. She had seen no one, spoken to no one beyond the other servants working alongside her. Surely there had been some confusion, some other servant girl who happened to fit a similar description. There were, after all, other veiled women in the household, older servants who covered themselves for reasons of their own. She told herself this firmly as she continued her morning duties, and for a while, the reasoning seemed to hold. But the rumors did not fade as the day went on. If anything, they grew stronger, spreading through the household like smoke through dry timber, until even the cooks in the kitchen were murmuring about it between tasks. They say the king himself was standing right outside that window, one of the older cooks, a stout woman named Bess, said, as she kneaded dough with practiced hands. Watching someone work, can you imagine? An alpha king, taking interest in kitchen staff. Probably nothing, another servant replied, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe her own words. Kings do not choose mates from among servants. It simply is not done. Ilara said nothing, focusing intently on the task in front of her, though her thoughts had become a tangled, anxious mess that refused to settle. She thought back to the previous evening, trying to remember every detail of her time in the kitchen. She had been alone for much of it, the other servants having been pulled away periodically to assist with the celebration upstairs. She had hummed while she worked, an old habit from childhood, a way of filling silence that had always felt too heavy to bear alone. Had someone seen her? Had someone actually stood at that window and watched her work, unaware that she was being observed? The thought sent an uncomfortable shiver through her, though she could not have said whether it was fear or something else entirely, something she did not yet have the courage to name. By midday, Miranda had summoned all the household servants to the main hall, her face tight with barely controlled agitation. She stood before them with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, Clara and Diane flanking her on either side, both wearing expressions that mixed suspicion with poorly hidden anxiety. "It has come to my attention," Miranda began, her voice carefully measured, "that the king showed some interest in a member of this household last evening. I want to know, right now, if anyone here spoke with him, or was seen by him near the kitchens." Silence fell over the assembled servants. Elara stood near the back of the group, her heart hammering against her ribs, unsure whether to speak or remain quiet. She had not spoken with the king. She had not even known he was near. But she had been in the kitchen, near that window, and the description matching a veiled servant girl felt uncomfortably specific. Before she could decide what to do, Bess spoke up from beside her. "Several of us were in and out of the kitchen last night, my lady." It could have been any of us. Miranda's sharp eyes swept across the gathered servants, lingering for just a moment too long on Elara before moving on. "If the king asks again, none of you are to speak with him without my knowledge. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and Miranda dismissed them with a wave of her hand, though her gaze lingered once more on Elara as the servants began to disperse. Elara felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, heavy and suspicious, though Miranda said nothing more directly to her. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous energy. Elara threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors and hauling water with more intensity than usual, hoping that exhaustion might quiet the strange, unsettled feeling that had taken root in her chest since morning. It did not entirely work. Every time a guard passed near the servants' quarters, every time an unfamiliar voice echoed through the halls, she found herself tensing, half expecting to be summoned, half expecting to be punished for a crime she was not even certain she had committed. It was near evening, as the household began preparing for another formal gathering meant to continue the king's visit, that Nella found her again, slipping into the small room Elara shared with two other servants, with a look of barely restrained excitement on her weathered face. "You will not believe what I just heard," Nella said, closing the door behind her carefully. Elara looked up from where she sat mending a torn hem, her stomach tightening with fresh anxiety. "What is it?" "The king has requested that all household staff be presented to him this evening, before the formal gathering begins. Miranda is furious, but she cannot refuse a direct request from an alpha king." Nella's eyes were bright with something between worry and wonder. "They say he wants to see for himself who was in the kitchens last night." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. "I cannot be presented before him. Miranda will never allow it, and even if she did, I would only embarrass this household further." "You may not have a choice," Nella said gently, sitting down beside her on the narrow bed. "A king's request is not something easily denied, even by someone like Miranda." The words settled over Elara like a heavy weight, and for a long moment, she simply sat in silence, trying to process the sudden, terrifying possibility that she might soon stand before the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, her scars fully visible, with no way to hide or escape his judgment. She had spent so many years learning to make herself small, to disappear into the background of every room she entered, that the idea of being forcibly presented, examined, and inevitably found wanting, felt like one of her deepest fears made suddenly, terribly real. "What if he recognizes me from last night?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to Nella. "What if this is exactly what Miranda fears, that I have somehow brought shame to this family without even meaning to?" Nella took her hand gently, her grip warm and reassuring, despite the uncertainty of the situation. "You have done nothing wrong, child. If the king wishes to see the household staff, that is his right as a guest of this pack. Whatever happens, you have not brought shame to anyone. You have only been yourself, and there is no shame in that." Elara wanted desperately to believe those words, but years of conditioning made it difficult to fully accept them. She had been taught, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that her very presence was something to be managed, hidden, apologized for. The idea that she could simply exist without shame felt almost foreign to her, a concept she understood intellectually, but had never truly internalized. As the sun began to set and the household prepared for the evening's events, word came down from Miranda herself that all servants were indeed to gather in a designated hall before the formal celebration began, so that the king's request could be honored without disrupting the larger gathering planned for later that night. Ilara dressed carefully, choosing her cleanest work dress and securing Nella's gift of a veil firmly over the scarred side of her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied the fabric in place, and she took a long moment to steady herself before joining the line of servants making their way toward the appointed hall. The hall itself was smaller than the grand space used for the previous night's formal introductions, but it felt no less intimidating as Ilara filed in alongside dozens of other household staff, all standing in careful rows, waiting for whatever was about to happen. She kept her eyes lowered, her body angled slightly, to keep the scarred side of her face turned away from the room's entrance, an old habit that offered little real protection, but provided some small comfort nonetheless. The doors opened, and a hush fell over the gathered servants as Cale Draven entered the hall, flanked by Rowan and a small contingent of guards. Edmund Hale followed close behind, his expression carefully neutral, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his discomfort with the entire situation. Cale's eyes moved slowly across the assembled servants, methodical and unhurried, as though he were searching for something specific among the rows of lowered heads and nervous faces. Ilara kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it must be audible to those standing near her. "I understand there was some concern," Cale said, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "about my presence near the kitchens last evening. I want to assure everyone here that no one has done anything wrong. I was simply curious about someone I saw briefly, and I hoped I might have the chance to properly introduce myself." His words did little to ease the tension in the room. If anything, they seemed to heighten it, as every servant present now understood that the king's search was specific, targeted, not the general curiosity Miranda had perhaps hoped it would turn out to be. Cale began walking slowly along the rows of servants, his gaze moving from face to face with careful attention. Ilara felt her entire body go rigid as his footsteps drew closer, every instinct urging her to somehow disappear, to melt into the stone floor beneath her feet and avoid whatever was about to happen. He paused several times along his path, offering brief, polite acknowledgments to servants who happened to catch his eye, though none of these pauses lasted more than a few seconds. Ilara kept her head down, her breathing shallow, praying silently that he would pass her by, as he had passed the others. His footsteps stopped directly in front of her. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching out into something almost unbearable, and Ilara found herself frozen in place, unable to look up, unable to move, caught in a moment she had never imagined would come. "You were in the kitchens last night," Cale said quietly, his voice gentler now than it had been moments before, meant for her ears alone, despite the crowded hall around them. It was not a question. Ilara understood, with a sinking, terrified certainty, that there was no point in denying it. Slowly, with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to steady them, she lifted her gaze to meet his for the very first time. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ilara stood frozen before him, her golden brown eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, while Cale studied her with an intensity that made the entire hall seem to fade away around them. Up close, she was even more striking than the brief glimpse he had caught the night before, her uncovered eye, clear and sharp with intelligence, her posture rigid, with the kind of tension that came from years of bracing for disappointment. "I did not mean to cause any trouble," Ilara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried easily in the silent hall. "I was only doing my work, my lord. I did not know anyone was watching." "You caused no trouble," Cale replied, and something in his tone made several nearby servants glance up in surprise, unaccustomed to hearing such gentleness directed at one of their own by a man of his standing. "I simply wish to know your name." The request hung in the air between them, simple in its wording, but enormous in its implications. Ilara was acutely aware of every eye in the hall now fixed upon her, of Miranda standing rigid near the front of the room, her expression a careful mask hiding what Ilara suspected was rising panic. Clara and Diane stood nearby as well, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to disbelief. "Ilara," she said finally, forcing the word out despite the tightness in her throat. "My name is Ilara, my lord." Cale repeated the name softly, as though testing its shape, and something in his expression shifted, though Ilara could not quite interpret what she saw there. "Ilara," he said again, "it is a fitting name." Before either of them could say more, Edmund Hale stepped forward with the smooth, practiced urgency of a man attempting to steer a difficult situation back onto familiar ground. "My lord, perhaps we should proceed to the formal gathering. The other guests are waiting, and there is much still to discuss regarding the alliance between our territories." Cale did not immediately respond, his gaze still lingering on Alara, with an attention that made her feel simultaneously exposed and, strangely, seen, in a way she had not experienced in years. Finally, he inclined his head slightly, though his eyes did not fully leave her face until the last possible moment. "Of course," he said, "lead the way." As Cale and his entourage began to move toward the exit, Rowan lingered a moment longer, his sharp eyes studying Alara with open curiosity, before he too turned to follow his king. The hall remained silent for several long seconds after they departed, the assembled servants seemingly uncertain how to process what they had just witnessed. Then Miranda's voice cut through the silence, cold and controlled, despite the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "Everyone, back to your duties. Now." The servants scattered quickly, eager to escape the tension that had settled over the room. But Miranda's hand shot out to grip Alara's arm before she could join them, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "What did you do?" Miranda hissed, her voice low enough that only Alara could hear it. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing," Alara said honestly, still reeling from the encounter herself. "I only gave him my name, as he asked. I did nothing else." Miranda's eyes narrowed, studying her stepdaughter's face as though searching for some hidden deception, some scheme that might explain why an Alpha King would take such obvious interest in a scarred servant girl when he could have his pick of any noble daughter in the territory. Finding nothing, she released Alara's arm with a sharp, dismissive motion. "This changes nothing," Miranda said firmly, though her voice carried an edge of uncertainty that betrayed her words. "You will remain in the kitchens for the rest of this visit. Whatever momentary curiosity the king showed, it will pass. Men like him do not choose mates from among servants. It is simply not done." Alara said nothing, though privately she found herself agreeing with every word. Whatever strange interest Cale Draven had shown her, she was certain it was fleeting, a passing curiosity born of novelty rather than anything deeper. Kings did not fall for scarred kitchen maids. That was the stuff of foolish stories told to children, not the reality of the world she had grown up in. And yet, as she made her way back to the kitchens that evening, her thoughts kept returning to the way he had said her name, the gentleness in his voice when he assured her she had caused no trouble, the way his storm-gray eyes had studied her scarred face, without the flicker of disgust she had come to expect from everyone else who looked upon it. She told herself firmly that it meant nothing, that she was reading far too much into a brief, strange encounter that would likely be forgotten by morning. But some small, stubborn part of her, the same part that had kept her walking through years of cruelty and dismissal, found itself holding on to the memory a little longer than was probably wise. The formal gathering that evening proceeded much as the previous one had, filled with careful conversation and political maneuvering, though Cale found himself far more distracted than he had been the night before. His mind kept drifting back to the hall where he had finally learned her name, to the way she had lifted her chin despite her obvious fear, meeting his gaze directly, rather than looking away in shame. He had expected, based on the rumors that had reached him throughout the day, to find a young woman broken by years of mistreatment, someone whose spirit had been thoroughly crushed by the cruelty of those around her. Instead, he had found something far more interesting, a quiet strength that reminded him of qualities he valued far more than beauty or charm, qualities that had been notably absent from every carefully rehearsed introduction he had endured over the past 2 days. "You seem distracted again," Rowan observed later that evening, finding a quiet moment to speak with his king, away from the crush of guests still lingering in the great hall. "I cannot stop thinking about her," Cale admitted, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard by nearby guests. There was something in her eyes, Rowan. Fear, yes, but also something else. A refusal to be entirely broken by what has clearly been a difficult life. Rowan studied his friend carefully, weighing his next words. "The Voss family will not welcome your interest in her, my lord. I have heard enough whispers today to know they see her as an embarrassment, someone to be hidden rather than celebrated." "I know," Cale said grimly. "I could see it in the way her stepmother reacted when I spoke with her. There is more cruelty in that household than I initially realized." What do you intend to do? Cale was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. He was not a man given to impulsive decisions, particularly not decisions that carried the weight of political consequence. Choosing a mate from among noble families was complicated enough. Choosing to pursue a servant girl, one clearly mistreated by her own family, would create complications far beyond what most would consider wise for a man in his position. And yet, when he thought of walking away, of returning to his territory and continuing the search for a suitable mate among noble daughters, who saw him only as a title to be claimed, something in his chest tightened with a resistance he had not expected. I intend to see her again, he said finally. Properly. This time. Not as a fleeting introduction in a crowded hall, but as an actual conversation, given the space and privacy to be honest with one another. Rowan raised an eyebrow, but did not argue. He had served Cale long enough to recognize the particular tone in his king's voice, the quiet determination that rarely wavered once it had settled into place. How do you intend to arrange that, given how closely her family seems intent on keeping her hidden? Cale allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile, the first genuine expression of amusement he had shown in days. I am an Alpha King, Rowan. I imagine I can find a way to speak with a member of a household I am currently a guest within, regardless of how uncomfortable that household might find the prospect. The following morning, before the household had fully stirred from sleep, a formal request arrived at the Voss residence, delivered by one of Cale's guards directly to Edmund Hale, who in turn delivered it, with visible reluctance, to Miranda Voss. The request was simple in its wording, but impossible to refuse without causing significant political offense. The Alpha King wished to speak privately with the servant Elara, at her convenience, within the gardens of the pack house. Miranda read the request twice, her face growing paler with each word, before finally setting it down on her writing desk, with hands that trembled slightly despite her attempts at composure. Clara and Diane, who had gathered nearby upon hearing the commotion, exchanged glances of disbelief and rising alarm. This cannot be happening, Clara said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. He cannot possibly be serious about her. It does not matter whether he is serious, Miranda said sharply, though her own uncertainty was evident in the strain of her voice. We cannot refuse a direct request from an Alpha King, regardless of how inconvenient it might be. She turned to look toward the servants' quarters, where Elara was likely still preparing for her morning duties, entirely unaware of the summons that awaited her. Fetch her, Miranda said finally, her tone resigned, despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Whatever comes of this, we will simply have to manage it as best we can. When word reached Elara of the king's request, she felt her entire world tilt sideways, uncertain and disorienting, in a way she had never experienced before. A private conversation, in the gardens, at his request. It seemed impossible, the kind of thing that happened in stories told to comfort children, rather than in the reality of her own carefully limited existence. And yet, as she made her way toward the gardens later that morning, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something she did not yet have the courage to call hope, she understood that whatever happened next would change the course of her life in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. The gardens behind the pack house were quiet at this early hour, the morning dew still clinging to the leaves of carefully tended rose bushes, the air cool and fresh in a way that felt almost unreal against the tension coiled tightly in Elara's chest. She had changed into her cleanest dress, though it remained simple and worn, compared to the fine gowns she had seen Clara and Diane wearing over the past 2 days. Nella's veil was secured carefully over the scarred side of her face, her hands having repeated the familiar motion so many times that morning that the fabric was tied more tightly than usual. Cale was already waiting when she arrived, standing near a small stone fountain at the center of the garden, his back to her as he looked out over the carefully arranged flower beds. He had exchanged his formal coat for something simpler, and without the weight of ceremony surrounding him, he seemed somehow less intimidating, though no less commanding in his presence. He turned as she approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them filled with an uncertainty that neither quite knew how to address. Elara stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, unsure of proper protocol for a situation she had never imagined finding herself within. "Thank you for coming," Cale said finally, his voice gentler than she remembered from their brief encounter the previous evening. "I was not certain you would." "I was not given much choice, my lord," Ilara replied honestly, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only simple truth. Something flickered across Cale's expression, a brief shadow of something that might have been regret. I did not intend to force you into anything uncomfortable. If my request has caused difficulties for you, I apologize sincerely. Ilara studied him for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She had expected, perhaps, the same casual dismissiveness she had encountered from most people of standing throughout her life, the assumption that her comfort mattered little compared to their own desires. Instead, she found herself facing something unexpected, an apparent genuine concern for how his actions had affected her. It has caused some difficulties, she admitted carefully, choosing her words with the caution of someone unaccustomed to speaking freely. My family does not entirely understand why an Alpha King would take interest in someone like me. And what do you think the reason might be? Cale asked, gesturing toward a stone bench nearby, an invitation for her to sit that she accepted somewhat hesitantly. She lowered herself onto the bench, keeping a careful distance between them as he settled onto the opposite end. I could not say, my lord. I am only a servant. There is little about me that would typically warrant a king's attention. I disagree, Cale said simply, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly exposed, though not in the way she had grown accustomed to fearing. Since I arrived at this territory, I have met dozens of young women, each presented to me as a potential mate, each performing the same careful rehearsed charm meant to convince me of their suitability for the position. Not one of them showed me anything real. You, however, I saw before you knew you were being observed. There was nothing performed in what I witnessed, only honesty. Ilara felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such directness. She had spent so many years learning to expect criticism, dismissal, or pity from those around her, that genuine admiration felt almost foreign, difficult to fully accept as real. I was simply doing my work, she said finally, unable to think of a more eloquent response. Precisely, Cale said, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. You were simply being yourself, without pretense, without performance. I find that far more compelling than anything I have encountered over the past 2 days. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sound of birds singing somewhere among the garden's carefully tended trees filling the space between them. Ilara found herself studying him carefully, trying to reconcile the powerful, commanding figure she had heard described in stories, with the surprisingly gentle man now sitting beside her. May I ask you something, my lord? She said finally, gathering her courage. Of course. Why does my appearance not trouble you? Most people cannot look at me without their expression changing, without some flicker of discomfort or pity crossing their face. You have shown neither. Cale considered the question carefully before answering, his gaze steady and thoughtful. I have seen scars before, Ilara. I carry several myself, earned in battles fought to protect the people under my care. Scars tell a story of survival, of strength that carried someone through something difficult. I see no reason why yours should be viewed any differently. These scars were not earned in battle, she said quietly, her fingers unconsciously moving toward the edge of her veil. They were left by a fire that took my father's life, and nearly took mine. I was only a child. There is no honor in that, no strength to be admired. I would argue otherwise, Cale said gently. Surviving is its own form of strength, regardless of how the wound was earned. You have carried this burden for most of your life, facing cruelty from those who should have shown you kindness instead, and yet you remain standing, working, existing, with a dignity that many people, myself included at times, would struggle to maintain under similar circumstances. Ilara felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, surprised by the sudden swell of emotion his words had provoked. No one had ever spoken to her this way before, had ever framed her survival as something worthy of admiration rather than pity or dismissal. She quickly blinked the tears away, unwilling to appear weak in front of him, though something in his expression suggested he would not have judged her for the reaction regardless. Would you show me? Cale asked softly, after a moment of comfortable silence had passed between them. Your face, I mean. Only if you feel comfortable doing so. I would never wish to pressure you into anything you are not ready for. The question hung in the air between them, simple in its wording, but carrying enormous weight given everything Ilara had experienced throughout her life. She had spent years hiding behind veils and careful positioning, protecting herself from the inevitable reactions of disgust and pity that came whenever her scars were fully visible. The thought of deliberately revealing them, especially to someone whose opinion had begun, against her better judgment, to matter to her, filled her with a fear so intense it nearly overwhelmed the small flicker of hope that had been growing within her since their conversation began. "I do not know if I can," she admitted honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is all right," Cale said immediately, no trace of disappointment or pressure in his tone. "There is no obligation here. I only wish to see you, truly see you, if you were willing to allow it. But your comfort matters more to me than my own curiosity." His willingness to accept her hesitation without judgment, without pushing further, did something to loosen the tight knot of fear that had been coiled in her chest since their conversation began. She found herself studying him carefully, searching for any sign of the disgust or pity she had learned to expect, and finding instead only patient, genuine interest. Slowly, with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to steady them, Ilara reached up and began to untie the veil that had protected her from the world for so many years. Cale remained perfectly still, giving her the time and space she needed, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that felt more respectful than dismissive. The fabric fell away, revealing the full extent of the scarring that stretched from her temple to her jaw, the twisted ridges of damaged skin, catching the morning light, in a way that made every imperfection starkly visible. She braced herself instinctively for the reaction she had witnessed countless times before, the flicker of discomfort, the quick glance away, the poorly hidden pity. It did not come. Cale's gaze remained steady, studying her with the same careful attention he had shown throughout their entire conversation, no trace of disgust or discomfort crossing his features. If anything, his expression softened further, something warm and genuine, replacing the careful neutrality he had maintained moments before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with this." Ilara felt something break open within her chest, a wall she had spent years carefully constructing, beginning to crumble under the weight of his simple, sincere gratitude. No dramatic declaration, no forced compliment about beauty she did not believe existed within herself, only honest acknowledgement of the trust she had extended him, and quiet respect for what that trust had cost her. "You truly do not find it troubling to look at?" she asked, needing to hear the confirmation, despite the evidence sitting plainly before her. "I find it a testament to survival," Cale said simply. "And if I am being entirely honest, Ilara, I find you remarkably beautiful, scars and all. Perhaps because of them, in part. They tell a story of someone who has faced tremendous hardship and refused to be broken by it." The words settled over her like warmth spreading through cold limbs, unfamiliar and almost overwhelming in their sincerity. She did not know how to respond, had no practiced words prepared for a moment like this one, and so she simply sat in silence, allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to believe that perhaps she was not as unworthy of kindness as she had spent so many years convincing herself she must be. They talked for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier territory as the initial tension between them began to fade. Cale asked about her childhood, her interests, the small details of her daily life that most people had never bothered to inquire about. Ilara found herself speaking more openly than she had with anyone in years, surprised by how easily the words came once she allowed herself to trust, even slightly, that he was genuinely interested in hearing them. When the conversation finally drew to a close, as duties and expectations called them both back toward their separate obligations, Cale rose from the bench and offered her a respectful bow, an acknowledgement that felt entirely foreign given her position as a servant. "I hope we might speak again," he said, his gray eyes holding hers with quiet sincerity. "I have enjoyed this conversation more than I can adequately express." "I would like that as well," Ilara admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the confession. As she made her way back toward the kitchens, her veil once again secured in place, Ilara found herself smiling faintly, an expression that felt unfamiliar on her face after so many years of careful neutrality. Something had shifted within her during that conversation in the garden, some fragile new hope taking root, despite every instinct urging her toward caution. She did not yet know how quickly that hope would be tested, or how fiercely those around her would fight to crush it before it had the chance to fully bloom. By midday, word of the private meeting in the gardens had spread through the pack house with the speed of a grass fire in dry summer wind. Servants whispered about it while carrying water, guards murmured about it during shift changes, and by the time Ilara returned to the kitchens, the atmosphere had shifted into something thick with tension and unspoken judgment. Bess, the older cook who had defended her during Miranda's earlier interrogation, gave her a long, searching look as she entered, though she said nothing directly. Other servants were not so restrained, offering pointed glances and hushed comments that Ilara pretended not to hear as she returned to her usual tasks, desperate for the familiar rhythm of work to steady her still racing thoughts. It did not take long for Miranda to summon her. Ilara found her stepmother waiting in the small study Miranda used for household business, Clara and Diane seated nearby, their expressions ranging from barely restrained fury to something closer to bewildered disbelief. Miranda's face was pale but composed, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed the effort it took to maintain that composure. "Sit down," Miranda said, gesturing toward a chair positioned before her desk. Ilara obeyed silently, lowering herself into the offered seat while trying to steady the nervous energy still coursing through her body from the morning's events. "I want to know exactly what happened in that garden," Miranda said, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious strain beneath it. "Every detail." Ilara hesitated, uncertain how much to share. Though she understood there was little point in withholding information Miranda would likely discover regardless. "The king wished to speak with me. He asked about my life, my thoughts. He was kind." "Kind," Clara repeated with obvious disbelief, her earlier golden confidence replaced by something sharp and bitter. "A king does not request private meetings with servants simply to be kind. Ilara, what did you say to him? What did you do to capture his attention?" "Nothing," Ilara said honestly, meeting her stepsister's gaze directly despite the discomfort of doing so. "I did nothing beyond answering his questions honestly. I did not seek his attention. I never expected to receive it." "And yet you have received it," Miranda said, her tone sharpening. "This is precisely the kind of situation I hope to avoid by keeping you away from him entirely. Do you understand what this means for this family, Ilara? For your sisters?" Ilara felt a familiar, exhausted frustration rising within her chest, the same feeling she had carried through years of being blamed for circumstances entirely beyond her control. "I did not ask for any of this," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, given the pounding of her heart. "I have spent my entire life trying to remain invisible, exactly as this family has demanded of me. I cannot control who the king chooses to speak with." "You could refuse further meetings," Miranda said sharply. "You could tell him you are unavailable, unsuitable, unworthy of his attention." The word unworthy struck something deep within Ilara, a wound she had carried for so long that she had almost forgotten it could still hurt this sharply. She had heard variations of that sentiment her entire life, whispered and shouted, implied and stated directly, until she had nearly convinced herself of its truth. But something about the conversation in the garden, about the way Cale had looked at her scarred face without flinching, without pity, had planted a small, stubborn seed of doubt about whether that lifelong assessment had ever truly been accurate. "I do not believe I am unworthy," Ilara said quietly, the words surprising even herself with their unexpected conviction. Silence fell over the study, heavy and charged, as Miranda and her daughters stared at Ilara with expressions of genuine shock. It was, perhaps, the first time in the years since she had joined this household that Ilara had directly contradicted an assessment of her own worth, and the small act of defiance seemed to catch everyone in the room, including Ilara herself, entirely off guard. "You forget your place," Miranda said finally, her voice dropping to something colder and more dangerous than before. "Whatever brief attention the king has shown you, it changes nothing about your position within this household, or this pack. You are a servant, Ilara. A charitable arrangement this family maintains out of obligation rather than affection. I would advise you to remember that before you allow foolish hopes to take root." The words were meant to wound, and they did, though not as deeply as they might have only days before. Something had shifted within Ilara during that quiet conversation in the garden, a small but significant recalibration of how she viewed her own worth, and while Miranda's cruelty still stung, it no longer held the same power to completely define her sense of self that it once had. "May I return to my duties?" Ilara asked, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. Miranda waved a dismissive hand, and Ilara rose quickly, grateful to escape the tense atmosphere of the study before her composure could fully crack. As she made her way back toward the kitchens, she caught Diane's eyes for just a moment and was surprised to see something almost like uncertainty flickering there, a brief crack in the usual dismissiveness her stepsister typically displayed. The rest of the day passed in a strange, uneasy tension, with servants and family members alike watching Alara with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion she had never experienced before. She threw herself into her work as best she could, though her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation in the garden, to the warmth in Cale's eyes when he had looked upon her scarred face without judgment. That evening, as the formal gatherings continued without her attendance, Alara found herself once again in the kitchens, though this time, the familiar solitude felt different somehow, charged with a strange new awareness of possibilities she had never previously allowed herself to consider. It was Nella who found her there, well past the hour when most servants had retired for the night, carrying a small covered dish that she set carefully on the counter beside Alara. "I thought you might not have eaten properly today," Nella said gently, settling onto a nearby stool. With everything that has happened, Alara offered her a grateful smile, though exhaustion had begun to settle heavily over her by that point in the evening. "Thank you, Nella. I do not know what I would do without your kindness." "You would manage," Nella said with a small, knowing smile. "You have always managed, even when circumstances gave you little reason to believe you could. But I am glad to offer what small comfort I am able to provide." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, Alara slowly eating the meal Nella had brought, while the older woman watched her with quiet, thoughtful attention. "May I ask you something?" Nella said finally, breaking the silence. "Of course. What did you feel when you spoke with him? The king, I mean. Beyond the fear and uncertainty, what did you actually feel?" Alara considered the question carefully, surprised by how directly it cut to the heart of the confusion she had been carrying since that morning's conversation. "I felt seen," she said finally, the words emerging slowly as she worked to articulate something she had not fully processed, even within her own thoughts. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt as though someone looked at me and saw a person, rather than a burden or an embarrassment to be managed." Nella nodded slowly, her expression softening with something that looked almost like relief. "That is a rare and precious thing, Alara. Do not allow anyone, including yourself, to convince you that you do not deserve it." The words settled over Alara with quiet weight, echoing something similar to what Cale himself had suggested only hours before. She finished her meal in thoughtful silence, grateful for Nella's steady presence, before finally retiring to her small room for the night. Sleep did not come easily, her mind too full of the day's events to settle into rest. She found herself replaying the conversation in the garden repeatedly, examining every word, every expression, searching for confirmation that what she had experienced was real, and not simply a product of her own desperate hope for something better than the life she had grown accustomed to expecting. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that similar sleeplessness had settled over Cale Draven that same evening, his own thoughts consumed by the memory of scarred features revealed with trembling trust, and a quiet strength that had impressed him more deeply than any carefully rehearsed performance he had witnessed throughout his search for a suitable mate. Nor did she know that the following morning would bring an announcement that would shatter whatever fragile peace remained within the Voss household, setting in motion a chain of events that neither she nor Cale could have fully anticipated. The formal announcement came the following morning, delivered before the entire assembled pack in the Great Hall, where representatives from noble families had gathered once again, expecting to hear news of which young woman had finally captured the Alpha King's interest after 2 days of careful courtship rituals. Cale stood before the gathered crowd with the same steady composure he had maintained throughout his entire visit, though those who knew him well, Rowan chief among them, could detect a subtle tension in his posture that suggested he understood the weight of what he was about to declare. "I have spent the past 2 days meeting with many worthy candidates," Cale began, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "Each of you has shown grace, intelligence, and dedication to your families in this pack. I do not make this decision lightly, nor do I intend any disrespect to those I have chosen not to pursue further." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd, young women straightening their postures, families leaning forward with barely restrained hope. Clara and Diane exchanged a hopeful glance, still clinging to the possibility that whatever strange interest the king had shown toward Alara might prove nothing more than a passing curiosity. I have made my decision, Kale continued, based not on lineage or performance, but on honesty and genuine character. I intend to formally court Alara, of the Voss household, with the intention of making her my queen, should our courtship prove successful. The silence that followed his announcement was absolute, stretching across the hall like a held breath, before shattering into a chaos of whispered disbelief and open shock. Miranda Voss went white as marble, her hand gripping the back of a nearby chair for support. Clara's face crumpled with something between humiliation and fury, while Diane simply stared, her mouth slightly open in stunned silence. Edmund Hale, standing nearby, struggled visibly to maintain his composure, though the surprise on his face was evident to anyone paying attention. This was not the outcome anyone had anticipated, least of all the elders who had spent weeks preparing for a more traditional match between the Alpha King and one of the territory's noble daughters. "My lord," Edmund said carefully, once the initial shock had settled enough to allow for speech, "this is an unexpected choice. May I ask what has led you to this decision?" Kale met the older Alpha's gaze steadily, no trace of hesitation in his expression. "I have witnessed genuine character in a world that too often values performance over substance. Alara has shown me honesty, resilience, and a quiet strength that I find far more valuable than practiced charm. I believe she would serve our people well, and I intend to give this courtship the respect and consideration it deserves." Murmurs continued to ripple through the crowd, some curious, some openly disapproving, as the pack members processed this unexpected turn of events. Several elders exchanged uneasy glances, clearly troubled by the unconventional nature of the king's choice, though none dared voice direct objection given his standing and authority. Alara, unaware that this announcement was even taking place, was in the kitchens as usual, scrubbing pots alongside Bess and the other servants, when Nella burst through the door with an expression of such urgent excitement that Alara immediately set down her work, alarmed. "You need to come with me right now," Nella said breathlessly. "The king has just made an announcement before the entire pack." "What kind of announcement?" Alara asked, though something in Nella's expression made her stomach twist with a mixture of hope and dread even before the words were spoken. "He has declared his intention to court you," Nella said, practically vibrating with barely contained emotion. "Formally, Alara, before everyone." For a long moment, Alara simply stood frozen, certain she must have misheard. "That cannot be right," she said finally, shaking her head slowly. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," Nella insisted, taking her hands firmly. The entire pack heard him say it. "Alara, you are going to be courted by the Alpha King." The words seemed to hang in the air around her, too enormous and impossible to fully process. Alara felt her legs grow suddenly weak, and she gripped the edge of the nearby counter for support, as the reality of the situation began to settle over her in waves. Before she could fully process what this meant, before she could even begin to formulate a response, the kitchen door burst open again, this time revealing Miranda, her face contorted with an expression of barely controlled fury that Alara had rarely witnessed even during their most difficult confrontations. "You," Miranda said, her voice trembling with rage as she crossed the kitchen in quick, sharp strides. "What have you done?" "I have done nothing," Alara said, though her voice shook with the same disbelief that had gripped her only moments before. "I did not know anything about this until Nella just told me." "He has humiliated this entire family," Miranda hissed, her fingers digging painfully into Alara's arm as she pulled her away from the safety of the counter. "Before the entire pack, he has chosen a scarred servant over my own daughters. And you expect me to believe you had no hand in orchestrating this?" "I orchestrated nothing," Alara said, finding a surprising strength in her voice, despite the pain of Miranda's grip. "I have spoken with him only once, in the gardens, at his own request. Whatever decision he has made, it is his own, not something I have manipulated into existence." Miranda's expression twisted further, torn between disbelief and something closer to helpless fury, at circumstances entirely beyond her control. She released Alara's arm abruptly, taking a step back, as though the physical distance might somehow help her process the situation more clearly. "This will not stand," Miranda said finally, her voice dropping to something colder and more calculating. "I do not know what game you believe you are playing, But I assure you, this family will not simply accept this humiliation without response." Before Alara could formulate a reply, the kitchen door opened once more, and this time it was Rowan who entered, his sharp eyes taking in the tense scene, before settling on Alara with an expression of careful, respectful attention. "The king requests your presence in the main hall," Rowan said, his tone polite, but leaving little room for refusal. "If you are willing." Alara looked toward Miranda, uncertain whether to seek permission from a woman who clearly wished this entire situation had never occurred, but Rowan's steady presence, and the formal nature of the request, made clear that this was not truly a matter Miranda had the authority to deny. "I will come," Alara said finally, straightening her shoulders despite the trembling uncertainty still coursing through her body. As she followed Rowan out of the kitchen, leaving behind Miranda's barely contained fury and Nella's tearful, hopeful expression, Alara felt as though she were walking toward some entirely new version of her life, one she had never dared imagine possible during all the years spent believing herself unworthy of anything beyond quiet survival. The great hall was still buzzing with whispered conversation when she entered, and every eye turned toward her as she made her way down the central aisle, toward where Kale stood waiting near the front of the room. She kept her chin lifted despite the weight of so many curious, judgmental, and in some cases, openly hostile gazes following her progress, drawing on a strength she had not fully realized she possessed until this moment demanded it of her. Kale's expression softened visibly as she approached, something warm and genuine replacing the careful diplomatic composure he had maintained throughout his announcement. He extended a hand toward her as she reached the front of the hall, and after only a brief hesitation, Alara accepted it, feeling the warmth of his fingers closing gently around her own. "I hope this was not too great a surprise," Kale said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone, despite the crowded hall around them. "It was an enormous surprise," Alara admitted honestly, unable to keep a faint, disbelieving smile from touching her lips, despite the chaos of emotions still churning within her. "But not an unwelcome one." Kale's answering smile was warm and genuine, a rare unguarded expression that several observers noted with surprise, having never witnessed such open emotion from their typically composed and measured king. "Then let us begin properly," Kale said, turning to address the gathered crowd once more, though his hand remained firmly wrapped around Alara's own. "I intend to court Alara with honor and respect, and I ask that this pack extend to her the same courtesy and welcome they would offer any potential queen." The murmurs that followed his declaration carried a complicated mixture of reluctant acceptance and lingering disapproval, but none present were foolish enough to voice open objection to an Alpha King's clearly stated intentions. As Alara stood beside him, her hand still held gently within his own, she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to believe that perhaps the life she had always assumed was permanently closed to her might, against every expectation, finally be opening into something new. She did not yet know how many challenges still lay ahead, how fiercely some among the pack would resist this unexpected turn of events, or how far certain individuals might be willing to go to ensure that a scarred servant girl never truly claimed the crown that had just been placed, however informally, within her reach. In the days that followed the public announcement, Alara found herself living a strange, dual existence that felt almost impossible to reconcile. By morning, she continued her usual duties in the kitchens, scrubbing pots and hauling water as she had for years, the familiar rhythm of labor providing an odd sense of stability amid the upheaval surrounding her. By afternoon, she was expected to join Kale for carefully chaperoned meetings, walks through the gardens, and quiet conversations that continued to deepen the connection that had begun so unexpectedly between them. The transition was not smooth. Miranda's household had grown colder toward her with each passing day, the earlier dismissive cruelty replaced by something more calculated and quietly vicious. Clara barely spoke to her at all now, her earlier open hostility replaced by a chilling silence that felt somehow more unsettling than her previous sharp words. Diane, surprisingly, seemed to soften slightly toward her, though she remained careful not to show open support in front of her mother or sister. It was during one such quiet afternoon walk through the gardens, several days into the formal courtship, that Alara first began to sense something troubling beneath the surface of her growing happiness. She and Kale had settled onto their usual bench near the stone fountain, the comfortable silence between them a welcome contrast to the tension that filled most of her remaining hours. "You seem troubled today," Cale observed, studying her carefully with the perceptive attention she had come to expect from him. "I am simply tired," Elara admitted, though it was only a partial truth. In reality, she had overheard fragments of a conversation earlier that morning, hushed voices from behind a closed door, that had made her stomach twist with unease. Tired from what, specifically? Cale pressed gently, clearly not fully convinced by her deflection. Elara hesitated, uncertain whether to share her concerns. She had grown accustomed to keeping difficulties to herself, a habit born from years of learning that voicing complaints rarely resulted in anything beyond further punishment or dismissal. But something in Cale's steady, patient gaze encouraged her to trust him with more than she typically allowed herself to share. "I overheard something this morning," she said finally. "Voices from Miranda's study. I could not make out everything clearly, but I heard my name mentioned alongside talk of finding a way to end this courtship before it progresses further." Cale's expression grew serious, his earlier warmth replaced by something more focused and protective. "Do you know who else was present in that conversation?" "I believe I recognized Clara's voice," Elara said carefully, "and possibly another voice I did not recognize at all. Someone who did not sound like a member of this household." This information seemed to trouble Cale more deeply than Elara had anticipated, his jaw tightening slightly as he considered the implications of what she had shared. "I will have Rowan look into this further," he said finally. "It would be wise to understand exactly what kind of opposition we might be facing before it has the chance to fully develop into something more dangerous. Do you truly believe someone would go so far as to actively work against this courtship?" Elara asked, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized the naivety in the question. She had, after all, spent years witnessing exactly how far certain people were willing to go to protect their own interests and reputation. "I believe," Cale said carefully, "that some people find it difficult to accept change that threatens their expected place within the world, particularly when that change challenges long-held assumptions about status and worth. Your stepfamily has clearly built much of their standing on maintaining certain appearances. My choice to court you disrupts that in ways they may find genuinely threatening." The conversation left Elara with a lingering unease that followed her back to her duties later that afternoon, a shadow over what had otherwise become the happiest period of her entire life. She found herself paying closer attention to the whispered conversations happening around the household, noting the way certain servants seemed to avoid her gaze, the way Miranda's expression had grown increasingly calculating rather than simply resentful. That evening, Rowan sought her out privately in a quiet corridor, away from the main flow of household activity, his sharp eyes carrying a seriousness that immediately put her on alert. "I have looked into the matter you mentioned to King Cale," Rowan said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not being overheard. "I have reason to believe your stepmother has reached out to someone with connections to a rival pack, someone who might benefit from seeing this courtship fail." Elara felt a chill move through her at this revelation, though it did little to genuinely surprise her given everything she already knew about Miranda's capacity for calculated cruelty. "What kind of rival pack?" she asked, her mind already racing through the implications. "There are several territories that have long sought closer alliance with the Draven pack through marriage," Rowan explained carefully. "Some of those families would be quite pleased to see King Cale's attention redirected toward a more traditional match, one that would strengthen political ties rather than simply following personal preference." "And you believe Miranda is working with one of these families?" Elara asked, struggling to fully process the scope of the conspiracy Rowan seemed to be describing. "I cannot say for certain yet," Rowan admitted. "But the pattern of behavior I have observed suggests something more organized than simple family disapproval. I would advise caution, Elara. Trust carefully in the coming days, and inform either myself or King Cale immediately if you notice anything that seems unusual or threatening." The warning settled heavily over Elara as she made her way back to her small room that evening, the fragile happiness she had begun to allow herself, now tempered by a growing awareness that powerful forces might be actively working to ensure her relationship with Cale never had the chance to fully develop. She thought of Miranda's cold, calculating expression during their earlier confrontations, of Clara's bitter silence, and wondered just how far her stepfamily might be willing to go to prevent what they clearly viewed as an unacceptable disruption to the natural order of their world. Sleep proved elusive once again that night, her mind circling through possibilities both mundane and deeply troubling. She thought of the small kindnesses Cale had shown her, the genuine warmth in his eyes when he looked upon her scarred face, and found herself determined not to allow fear to steal away the fragile happiness that had finally, against every expectation, begun to take root within her carefully guarded heart. The following morning brought fresh evidence that Rowan's concerns had merit. Elara arrived at the kitchens to find an unfamiliar young woman standing near the entrance, dressed in clothing that marked her as a servant from a neighboring territory, engaged in quiet conversation with one of the household guards. The moment Elara appeared, both individuals fell silent, exchanging a quick, uncomfortable glance before the unfamiliar woman departed hurriedly through a side entrance. Bess, noticing the exchange from her position near the ovens, offered Elara a troubled look. "That woman has been seen around the household several times this week," she said quietly, once the guard had also moved away. "Always speaking with different members of staff, always disappearing quickly whenever anyone pays too much attention. Do you know who she works for?" Elara asked, her earlier unease sharpening into something closer to genuine alarm. "I could not say for certain," Bess admitted, "but her manner of dress suggests she serves a household from outside our own territory. It seems strange that she would have reason to be here so frequently, unless someone within this household specifically summoned her." The information only confirmed what Rowan had already suggested, and Elara found herself struggling to focus on her usual duties throughout the remainder of the morning, her thoughts consumed by growing worry about what exactly Miranda and her unknown allies might be planning. She did not have to wait long to find out. That afternoon, as she made her way toward the gardens for her usual meeting with Cale, she was intercepted by Diane, who pulled her aside into a quiet alcove with an expression of genuine anxiety that Elara had rarely witnessed from her stepsister. "I need to tell you something," Diane said quickly, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though fearful of being overheard. "I do not fully agree with what Mother and Clara are planning, but I am too afraid to openly oppose them." "What are they planning?" Elara asked, her heart beginning to pound with fresh anxiety. "I overheard them discussing a plan to discredit you before the king," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something involving a false accusation, meant to convince him that you are unworthy of his trust and attention. I do not know all the details, but I know they intend to act soon, perhaps within the next few days." The revelation settled over Elara like a physical weight, confirming her worst fears about the depth of her stepfamily's determination to end her relationship with Cale, by whatever means necessary, regardless of the cost to her reputation or well-being. "Thank you for telling me," Elara said finally, genuinely surprised by this unexpected act of loyalty from a stepsister, who had shown her little kindness throughout the years they had lived together. "I am not doing this for you," Diane said quickly, though her expression suggested more complicated feelings than her words conveyed. "I simply do not believe some of what Mother is planning is right. Whatever happens between you and the king, you deserve the chance to face it honestly, not through lies and manipulation." As Diane hurried away, leaving Elara alone in the quiet alcove with her racing thoughts, she understood with growing clarity that the challenges facing her relationship with Cale were only beginning, and that the coming days would likely test both her courage and her fragile new hope in ways she had never previously imagined having to face. The accusation came 3 days later, delivered with calculated precision, during a formal gathering meant to celebrate the progress of the courtship between Cale and Elara. The Great Hall was filled once again with pack members and visiting dignitaries, the atmosphere festive, despite the undercurrent of tension that had followed Elara throughout the preceding days. Elara stood near Cale's side, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that Cale himself had arranged to be made for her, a gesture that had moved her deeply, given how little anyone had ever invested in her appearance or comfort throughout her life. She had grown slightly more comfortable in these formal settings over the past days, though the weight of curious and sometimes hostile stares never fully disappeared. It was Miranda who initiated the confrontation, stepping forward from among the gathered crowd with an expression of carefully performed distress, Clara flanking her with matching solemnity. "My lord," Miranda said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, drawing immediate attention from every direction. I must speak, though it pains me greatly to do so. I fear you have been deceived regarding the true character of the woman you intend to court. Cale's expression shifted immediately into something guarded and watchful, though he did not release Alara's hand, as the crowd around them fell into tense silence. What exactly are you claiming, Miranda? I have recently discovered troubling information, Miranda continued, her voice carrying a practiced tremor of reluctant honesty that Alara recognized immediately as performance. Evidence suggesting that Alara has engaged in theft from this household, taking valuable items over the course of many months. I have tried, out of family loyalty, to keep this matter private, but I cannot in good conscience allow you to proceed further without knowing the truth. A collective gasp moved through the assembled crowd, and Alara felt her stomach drop as dozens of eyes turned toward her, with renewed suspicion and judgment. She opened her mouth to protest, but Miranda continued before she could speak, producing a small velvet pouch that she held aloft for the crowd to see. This was found hidden among her belongings just this morning, Miranda said, her voice growing stronger with practiced conviction. A family heirloom that has been missing for several weeks. Alara stared at the pouch in disbelief, recognizing it immediately as a piece she had never seen before in her life, let alone stolen or hidden among her few meager possessions. This is not true, she said firmly, finding her voice despite the shock coursing through her. I have never seen that item before this moment. I have taken nothing from this household. The evidence suggests otherwise, Clara added quickly, her earlier bitter silence replaced by eager participation in her mother's scheme. It was found in your room, beneath your mattress. How else would it have arrived there if not through your own actions? Alara felt panic rising within her chest as she recognized the trap that had been carefully constructed around her, understanding immediately that someone must have deliberately planted the item to lend credibility to this fabricated accusation. She looked toward Cale, desperate for him to see the truth behind Miranda's carefully performed distress, though fear gripped her at the possibility that even he might begin to doubt her given the seemingly damning evidence presented before the entire pack. Cale's expression remained carefully neutral as he studied the pouch Miranda held, though his grip on Alara's hand tightened slightly, a small gesture of reassurance that steadied her racing heart despite the chaos of the moment. This is a serious accusation, Cale said finally, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that immediately quieted the murmuring crowd. One that deserves careful investigation rather than immediate judgment. Alara, do you have any response to this claim? I have never taken anything from this household, Alara said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the fear still coursing through her. I did not know that item existed until this very moment. Someone must have placed it among my belongings deliberately. And why? Cale asked, turning his attention back toward Miranda with a subtle sharpness that suggested he was far less convinced by her performance than she had likely hoped. Did you wait until this particular moment, during a formal gathering witnessed by the entire pack, to bring forward evidence you claim to have discovered this very morning? Miranda's composure flickered slightly under this direct questioning, though she recovered quickly. I felt it important that such matters be addressed openly, my lord, rather than hidden away, as though we had something to conceal. Or perhaps, Rowan interjected smoothly, stepping forward from where he had been observing the confrontation with careful attention. You felt it important that such an accusation be witnessed by as many people as possible, ensuring maximum damage to Alara's reputation, regardless of whether the claim proves accurate upon proper investigation. Miranda's face paled slightly at Rowan's pointed observation, though she maintained her composure with visible effort. I do not appreciate the implication that I would fabricate such a serious accusation against my own stepdaughter, particularly one that reflects poorly on this family's reputation as well. And yet, Cale said, his tone growing noticeably cooler, I find myself struggling to understand why a family so concerned with reputation would choose to air such accusations before an audience, rather than addressing them privately first, unless the public humiliation itself served some particular purpose. The tension in the hall grew thick as the true nature of the confrontation became increasingly apparent to those watching, several pack members exchanging uncertain glances as they began to reconsider their initial assumptions about the validity of Miranda's claims. I would like to propose a proper investigation, Cale continued, addressing the crowd more broadly now. One conducted fairly, examining all available evidence, including the circumstances under which this item was supposedly discovered. Until such an investigation is complete, I will not accept accusations leveled without proper process, regardless of how dramatically they are presented. Edmund Hale stepped forward at this point, clearly recognizing the need to restore some sense of order to the increasingly chaotic gathering. I agree that a formal investigation is warranted, my lord. I will personally oversee the process to ensure fairness for all parties involved. As Edmund began organizing the practical details of the investigation, Ilara found herself trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to fade and leave behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made it difficult to fully process everything that had just occurred. Cale's hand remained firmly wrapped around her own, a steady anchor amid the chaos surrounding them. "I did not do this," she said quietly, meant only for his ears, though her voice carried a note of desperate need for him to believe her, despite the damning evidence Miranda had presented. "I know," Cale said simply, his gray eyes steady and certain as they met her own. "I have seen enough of your character over these past days to know this accusation does not reflect who you truly are. Whatever games your stepmother is playing, I do not intend to allow them to succeed." His unwavering confidence in her innocence, offered without hesitation despite the public nature of the accusation and the seemingly damning evidence presented, filled Ilara with a gratitude so profound it nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes. No one, throughout her entire life, had ever extended her such immediate, unconditional trust, and the experience of receiving it now, during what should have been one of the most humiliating moments of her life, felt almost overwhelming in its unfamiliar warmth. The investigation began that very evening, with Rowan taking primary responsibility for examining the circumstances surrounding the supposedly stolen item. Ilara was questioned extensively about her activities over the preceding weeks, though she answered every inquiry honestly, confident that the truth would eventually emerge, despite the elaborate scheme constructed against her. It did not take long for cracks to begin appearing in Miranda's carefully constructed accusation. A servant, questioned separately by Rowan, admitted under careful questioning that she had witnessed an unfamiliar woman, matching the description of the visitor Bess had noticed lingering around the household in recent days, entering the servants' quarters early that very morning, shortly before Miranda's dramatic revelation before the assembled pack. Further investigation revealed that the supposedly missing heirloom had never actually belonged to the Voss family at all, but had instead been recently acquired through an intermediary, with known connections to a rival pack territory, one whose leading family had long expressed interest in strengthening ties with the Draven pack through more traditional marriage arrangements. As the true scope of the conspiracy began to unravel, piece by careful piece, Ilara found herself caught between vindication and a deeper, more troubling realization about just how far certain individuals were willing to go to protect their own interests, regardless of the harm inflicted upon someone they viewed as merely an inconvenient obstacle to be removed. The investigation would take several more days to fully complete, but even as the initial evidence began pointing clearly toward her innocence, Ilara understood that this confrontation had likely been merely the opening move in a larger, more dangerous game, one that threatened not only her fragile new happiness, but potentially her very safety, as those who opposed her relationship with Cale grew increasingly desperate to prevent it from succeeding. The full truth emerged 5 days later, delivered not through quiet private conversation, but through another dramatic confrontation before the assembled pack, one that Cale himself had carefully orchestrated to ensure that whatever damage had been done to Ilara's reputation could be just as publicly and thoroughly repaired. Rowan stood before the great hall, a stack of carefully gathered evidence in hand, while Miranda, Clara, and a third individual, a sharp-featured man identified as an emissary from the rival Thornwood territory, stood before the crowd with expressions ranging from defiant anger to poorly concealed panic. "The investigation is complete," Rowan announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "We have confirmed, through multiple independent witness accounts and physical evidence, that the item presented as a stolen family heirloom was, in fact, purchased specifically for the purpose of this false accusation, arranged through contact with representatives of the Thornwood pack, who sought to disrupt King Cale's courtship of Ilara in favor of a more politically advantageous match." Gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd as the full scope of the conspiracy was laid bare before them. Miranda's face had gone ashen, her earlier composed defiance crumbling under the weight of evidence that left little room for continued denial. The item was planted in Alara's quarters by a servant working on behalf of the Thornwood emissary, Rowan continued, gesturing toward the sharp-featured man, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of accusing stares. A servant who has since confirmed this arrangement, along with the payment received from Miranda Voss for her cooperation in constructing this elaborate deception. Cale stepped forward then, his expression carrying a controlled fury that made even hardened pack elders shift uncomfortably in his presence. This was not merely an attempt to embarrass one individual, he said, his voice carrying clear authority across the hall. This was a deliberate scheme to manipulate the choices of an Alpha King, through deception and false accusation, an act that undermines the trust and stability this pack depends upon. Miranda opened her mouth as though to offer some final defense, but found no words adequate to the moment, her earlier calculated confidence entirely dissolved under the weight of undeniable evidence and Cale's clear, controlled anger. I trust, Cale continued, turning his attention toward Edmund Hale, that appropriate consequences will be determined for those involved in this conspiracy, in accordance with pack law and tradition. Edmund nodded grimly, clearly troubled by the depth of betrayal and manipulation that had been uncovered within his own territory. It will be handled with the seriousness this situation demands, my lord. Those responsible will face appropriate consequences for their actions. As the formal proceedings continued, addressing the practical matters of consequence and restitution, Elara stood quietly beside Cale, watching the collapse of Miranda's carefully constructed scheme, with a complicated swirl of emotions she struggled to fully process. There was vindication, certainly, relief at seeing the truth finally acknowledged before the entire pack. But there was also a lingering sadness, an acknowledgement that even now, faced with undeniable proof of her innocence, there remained no genuine reconciliation to be found with the family that had caused her so much pain throughout the years of her life spent within their household. When the formal proceedings finally concluded, with Miranda and Clara facing serious consequences for their role in the conspiracy, and the Thornwood emissary being formally expelled from Silverfang territory, with clear warnings about the diplomatic consequences of further interference, Cale turned to Elara with an expression that had softened considerably from the controlled anger he had displayed throughout the confrontation. I am sorry you had to endure this, he said quietly, once they had found a moment of relative privacy away from the dispersing crowd. No one should have to face such deliberate cruelty, particularly not after everything you have already survived throughout your life. You believed me, Elara said simply, the words carrying weight beyond their apparent simplicity. From the very beginning, even before any evidence had been gathered, you believed me. I do not think I can adequately express what that meant to me. I meant every word I said that day, Cale replied, his gray eyes holding hers with quiet sincerity. I have watched your character throughout these past weeks, Elara, and I have found nothing but honesty and genuine strength. False accusations, however dramatically presented, could never overshadow what I have witnessed firsthand. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of recent events beginning to settle into something more manageable now that the truth had finally been acknowledged. Diane approached them cautiously a short while later, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and lingering guilt. I am glad the truth came out, Diane said quietly, addressing Elara directly for perhaps the first time, with genuine warmth rather than practiced dismissiveness. I should have spoken up sooner, done more to prevent what happened. I am sorry I did not. You told me what you knew, when it mattered most, Elara said, offering her stepsister a small but genuine smile. That took courage, given the circumstances. I do not hold the rest against you. Diane's expression softened with visible gratitude, and something shifted subtly in the dynamic between them, the beginning, perhaps, of a relationship built on more honest foundations than the one that had existed throughout their years living under the same roof. In the weeks that followed, life within Silverfang territory gradually settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by the public acknowledgement of Elara's innocence and the growing acceptance, however grudging in some quarters, of her position as Cale's intended mate. The formal courtship continued, deepening steadily as the two of them spent increasing time together, their conversations ranging from thoughtful discussions of pack governance to simple, comfortable silences shared in the garden where their connection had first truly begun to bloom. Miranda and Clara faced formal consequences for their conspiracy, though Cale, despite his justified anger at their actions, showed a measure of mercy in ensuring their punishment focused on restitution and formal censure rather than more severe traditional penalties. It was, Ilara understood, a reflection of the same fundamental character that had drawn her to him from their very first true conversation, a strength tempered by genuine fairness and compassion, even toward those who had wronged him and the woman he had chosen to court. The formal ceremony, when it finally arrived several months later, was unlike anything Silverfang territory had witnessed in generations. Ilara stood before the assembled pack, dressed not in borrowed finery or hand-me-down garments, but in a gown, crafted specifically for her, one that celebrated, rather than concealed the scars that had once been used as weapons against her sense of worth. She wore no veil that day, her scarred features fully visible to the gathered crowd for the first time since her childhood, a deliberate choice that Cale had supported fully, understanding the significance of the moment for a woman who had spent so many years hiding behind fabric and shame. As Cale placed the ceremonial crown upon her head, formally recognizing her as Queen of the Draven Pack, Ilara felt the last remaining fragments of her old fears and insecurities finally begin to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence that had been growing within her since that first unexpected conversation in the garden weeks before. "They mocked you once," Cale said quietly, his voice meant only for her ears, as the crowd erupted into celebration around them, hidden behind that veil, believing your worth could be measured by the damage a fire left upon your skin. "I hope, from this day forward, you will always know how deeply mistaken they were." Ilara looked out over the celebrating crowd, at faces that had once regarded her with pity or dismissal, now offering genuine respect and welcome, and felt a profound gratitude settle over her, not merely for the love she had found with Cale, but for the journey that had finally allowed her to recognize her own inherent worth, scars and all. "I know," she said softly, meeting his gaze with quiet certainty. "I know now, because you were the first to truly see me, and because of that, I finally learned to see myself the same way." As the celebration continued around them, the newly crowned queen and her king stood together, hand in hand, ready to build a future founded not on the cruel judgments of the past, but on the genuine love and mutual respect that had grown between them from the very moment he had first lifted her veil and fallen in love with the woman he found beneath it.